From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's coming up. From the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock is featured on this week's cattle market segment. In addition to her observations on the current market trends, she'll take a look at the latest consumer price index numbers pertaining to meat and poultry and where beef prices are trending. Also joining us today from the Cover Your Acres Winter Conference in Northwest Kansas, K-State's Sarah Lancaster will talk about new regulations pertaining to over-the-top herbicide applications to soybeans. Important developments that she says have repercussions for herbicide use in general moving forward. And K-State's Mike Brouk awaits with another edition of Milk Lines. All that right here on Agriculture Today. Glad to have you aboard for another Agriculture Today. And to get this edition going, we'll talk cattle markets. Normally, that segment occurs on a Monday, but yesterday was a federal holiday. We were away, so we pushed this conversation back one day. As we talk with Katelyn McCullock. Katelyn is the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center based in Denver. Katelyn, we have quite a smorgasbord of things to pick up on this week, and we'll do so after the quick recap of this last week's price action. Fed cattle market seems to remain relatively stable.
So the 5 area ended the week about 136 for live steers, fading a little bit from last month, right? We're not seeing quite the high values that we saw in December, but I think that's to be expected based on what we've seen slaughter rates do. We're once again experiencing a little bit of pinch at the slaughter plant capacity level. And so I think, that 136 looks pretty good if you are anticipating absenteeism and labor shortages moving forward. On the feeder cattle side, we've had really strong weeks in the cash markets in December and in January. Widespread reports across the U.S. that activity at feeder cattle auctions has been really, really strong, and many cow-calf producers have been able to capitalize on that. On the box beef side, again, a little bit of price action, I think, relative to the lower slaughter levels. We have seen choice cutout come back up. So in December, we saw that fade a little bit, back down into that 260 range for choice. And on Friday, we closed at 284. So bumped back up quite a bit considering where we are in the calendar year, but I think from what's going on the slaughter plant side, that explains most of it. On the futures market, things have been really reactive to this slaughter plant news and daily slaughter rates, even though those are estimated. I think there's some nerves going on. We saw price action on both sides. We had days where live cattle were up and down by quite a bit. I think Friday, live cattle futures ended up across the board. That April contract still over 142. On the feeder cattle side, didn't close the week quite as good. Several of those contracts ended the week a little bit down, but some were a little bit up. And I think, at least in the back half of 2022, those feeder cattle contracts are still showing very strong prices over 180.
Katelyn, the recurring theme, and you brought it up a couple of times, has been that slaughter slowdown, largely reportedly because of packing plant absenteeism. Your thoughts here, the longer-term impact on the industry being able to remain current as we move forward here?
I think it's something to watch. The couple things that I don't want to overblow it or overhype it, just because this is different than where we were in 2020, where a lot of those packing plants and companies incentivized vaccines. CDC also shortened the quarantine window. And so both of those things are positive in the sense that the absenteeism or COVID-related work time miss should be shorter than it was in previous years. And so I'm pointing to that as hopefully this is a relatively short-lived event, but you also have several rolling sort of things that have coincided, right? So the holidays when people got together might have been an exposure incident, New Year's, and then now you have kids back in school. And so this might just kind of roll through the weeks a little bit longer than you might anticipate based on the two things I just mentioned. But per event, it shouldn't be as long and as severe as maybe previous years have been related to COVID. And Omicron is by all accounts, seems a little bit more mild for most people. And so it should kind of work itself through fairly quickly. Now, that doesn't mean we immediately get back on track, that it doesn't take time to work through those animals that would have been processed during those weeks, but I'm thinking this might be fairly short-lived.
Want to visit about something that would tie back into what you just shared on the boxed beef side, where those prices have shown a bit of bounce here going into 2022. The information that you have just received on the Consumer Price Index numbers, these are the very latest updated numbers for the month of December on, in particular, the Meat and Poultry Consumer Price Index. Share with us what those numbers tell us, if you would.
Unfortunately, it's not necessarily good news. So the Consumer Price Index rose 7%, which is a very, very high number year over year. The food CPI, so that's including meat, poultry, but other things as well, increased 6.3%. And that's the highest since 2008. So fairly aggressive numbers there. Poultry by itself climbed 9.5% from a year ago, and that's because that retail price really spiked in December. The meat CPI, so that's pork and beef and lamb, 14.8% above a year ago, slowed slightly from the previous month. But, these sorts of increases are levels that haven't really been seen since probably the 70s or 80s. So definitely worth watching. Now, from a retail price perspective, which also comes out with that CPI data, we did see a little bit of a decline in those beef prices. I'm not sure I would read too much into that. Inflation does seem to be creeping in from all sides on a consumer perspective, not just in the meat case or groceries, but if you talk about fuel, housing, consumer cyclical goods, all of that has become increasingly more expensive. And the Federal Reserve did indicate that they were going to raise rates probably in 2022, something to watch as well as they make some adjustments to try and combat high inflation.
Well, the wild card here, of course, is what is the breaking point in as far as higher meat prices, beef prices specifically, before it starts to ebb at demand. Nobody can say that for sure, but that's the thing you think the industry should be watching closely.
So normally when you'd see a price this high at the retail case, you would see some substitution. People would buy either less expensive beef cuts, lower quality, or shift to another protein. So far, we haven't seen a slowdown in what appears to be interest in buying beef. If you look at high quality cuts, those did remarkably well in the fourth quarter. That could somewhat be time of year. I think we'll have to see where this first quarter ends up. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, choice beef was above 280 again. And that's a positive sign. It could be mostly on the supply side, so something we need to watch and be careful of. I wouldn't necessarily say, that's demand based on what's happening at the slaughter level, but what that choice box beef or what any of the cutout numbers do is going to be something to watch and point to see how well we're moving that meat still.
All right. Well, more numbers at hand here. This on the production side, and that would have to do with hay stocks, availability of hay. We've been talking ad nauseum about the drought that prevailed in so many parts of the country, in the West in particular in 2021, and the worries about hay supplies. Are those worries being reflected and confirmed in these new numbers, Katelyn?
Unfortunately, more bad news here too, Eric. And if I'm not careful, I'm going to get a reputation on your radio show. But hay stocks for December 1 is down 6% nationally. Now, a lot of the problem areas that showed steep year-over-year declines were limited to the west, so west of the Rockies and the northern plains. If you look across the northern plains, those were some of the most dramatic decreases. Montana down 40% from a year ago. Both North and South Dakota down over 40%. Minnesota down 35%. And then some of the western states also down in the high 20s, in some cases over 40% there. And so what you have is a continued negative situation for an area that's already experienced drought for 2 years. There's a La Nina watch continued. And so I'm pretty concerned with what forage availability looks like, as well as how much that's going to cost. We raised our alfalfa national average price for next year to over $200 a ton, so fairly in line with what this year's going to be. But I would expect that other hay number to be probably in the high 140s, maybe even 150s. The other thing that comes out with this December 1 hay stocks report is new seedings of alfalfa. there was a considerable decline in how many acres were used. It's the lowest on record. Now, this isn't a long data set, but this goes back to the 1990s. But that was down, I think, over 25%. And so it really looks like you're not going to get any help from the acreage side. And part of that is because you have such higher priced commodities. Virtually no matter what region of the country you're talking about, there is a higher priced crop you could put in the ground. And so that's not going to help hay very much. Yes, you could get some back with better than average yields, but those remain to be seen. And so I think your hay outlook right now is fairly negative if you're a livestock producer. The other thing we're watching, and you mentioned the drought monitor, we're seeing some development of drought in the Southern Plains, an area that we haven't really seen the drought in the last 2 years. That's probably a key area we're watching. Texas is the number 1 or 2 hay producing state in the U.S. virtually every year. So large impacts there if that continues.
And then the question becomes, will this potentially result in accelerated herd liquidation beyond what was anticipated already? And once more, the answer to come, but it could be leaning that way, Katelyn.
I think it's definitely a possibility, especially when you consider that area hasn't probably been the focus of a lot of culling in previous years, whereas the West has had now probably 2 years of continuous herd reduction in some of those states. Northern Plains obviously had a larger year this year too. Those are going to happen in 2022 and won't affect our January 1 numbers quite yet, whereas that major impact is going to be from that western drought last year in the Northern Plains.
Well, that input very much appreciated. As always, it's good to visit, and in about a month, we'll do the same, Katelyn. Thanks for these comments right here.
Thank you, Eric.
The director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, which is a project co-sponsored by K-State among several land-grant universities, Katelyn McCullock on the cattle markets. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now, and here we're drawing from information that's being presented today and tomorrow at the Cover Your Acres Winter Conference for Crop Producers, being hosted by K-State Research and Extension in Oberlin, northwest Kansas. At that conference now, we're in touch with Sarah Lancaster, Weed Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And Sarah, our aim here is to have you pass along some of the key points you're conveying to producers at that conference along the theme of rolling with the punches in one's crop weed management this year. And one of those things you'll be addressing there, new regulatory changes in the herbicide world, right?
That's right, Eric. So as you mentioned, the title of my presentation is Rolling with the Punches. And so, that's very much in keeping with the theme of a lot of the things that you and I have talked about here on radio lately. We've spent a lot of time talking about issues associated with supply chain concerns for herbicides and pricing for herbicides and things of that nature. One of the other factors that plays into the added complication of management decisions for farmers in 2022 are some regulatory concerns. So, when I say this, I'm thinking largely about herbicide-resistant soybeans. I think the things that are happening in herbicide-resistant soybeans that are going to have pretty significant impacts on growers this summer are things that we need to be aware of for all of our chemistries.
So elaborate on that. And this has to do with new restrictions or the mode of action or the rate of use, what?
So a few things. So let's take a step back and think about just the herbicide registration process in general. So glyphosate, atrazine, and paraquat I've been talking about a fair bit in the last couple of years because they're all undergoing this periodic re-registration process that all pesticides have to go through. Okay, it's not a bad thing. We develop new information all the time, and that new information should go in to helping us use these products in the best way possible. One of the things that is throwing a lot of wrenches into use plans is the Endangered Species Act. Like it or not, the Endangered Species Act has a big impact on where, when, and how we can use these products. And Eric, I think most of your listeners, if not all of our listeners today, agree with me that we, as agriculturalists, have an obligation to take care of the land around us and to take care of the things that live in the land around us.
It's part of stewardship.
It's a stewardship thing, right? And agriculturalists are great stewards of the land. Not everyone agrees with that, but I would argue that we are. And so we're seeing a lot of changes in these labels that have to do with the Endangered Species Act. Okay, so that preamble is all to kind of set up one of the big pieces of news in weed science that came down earlier, and that is the announcement of the newly approved 7-year labels for Enlist 1 and Enlist Duo, which are the 2,4-D formulations that are labeled for use in Enlist soybean and cotton.
Over-the-top treatments.
Over-the-top treatments, and, they're the one product that has a 0-day plant-back interval for those crops if you use them burned down, things of that nature. So we're glad that we have this new Enlist label. Okay, we at least have some clarity here in terms of what's going on. There are some things that applicators and farmers need to be aware of, though, as they think about this label if they're looking at using Enlist soybeans for next year. One of the first ones I think we should talk about before we dive back to the Endangered Species Act are these mitigation practices that are required to reduce runoff. So we want to keep our soil in our fields. We want to keep all the pesticides that we apply in our field because that's where we need them, right? Mm-hmm. But farmers will have to look at this label and piece together various soil conservation practices to mitigate runoff. And the number of practices they have to use is going to be based on their soil type.
And those practices sort of run the gamut, don't they, as far as land treatments?
Yeah. So, I'm actually looking at the list right now, Eric. So management practices could include everything from reducing tillage to cover crops to filter strips to waterways. So there's a lot of options there that, quite frankly, guys are doing anyway in all likelihood. The other thing that is listed there is to reduce the number of applications of Enlist. So that's one thing that's going on with that label. The other thing that is going on with that label that I do know has some folks in the industry very, very concerned right now is the fact that there are 10 counties in Kansas in which folks that use Enlist are going to have some additional requirements. And, really, it's much like when the dicamba labels, the over-the-top dicamba labels first came out. We talked a lot about endangered species counties. You've got to go to the website and see what's required of you based on the particular EPA website. So those 10 counties in Kansas are Chautauqua, Cherokee, Cowley, Elk, Greenwood, Labette, Montgomery, Neosho, Wilson, and Woodson.
All in the southeastern part of the state.
Mm-hmm. And so some of those, not a lot of soybeans, but some of those are pretty important soybean-producing counties for the state of Kansas. And so it's my understanding that there is a soil-dwelling insect that is the endangered species that has been flagged in those counties. And so, to be honest, Eric, I need to do some more digging and get some more information there about exactly what all that entails. But the other thing I will tell you is that there may be possibly some adjustments to what some of those restrictions look like going forward. So, really, we're probably 2 to 4 weeks away from, kind of knowing for sure how the dust is going to settle, so to speak, around all of the requirements for those 10 counties in Kansas. So we need to just kind of be patient. I know that that's hard for me.
But producers need to be on top of this because they'll be pulling the trigger on securing their herbicide supplies not too long from now if they haven't started that process already.
Right. One of the things we've been talking about all winter, Eric, is take possession of your herbicides as soon as possible, right? So now we're in this kind of limbo position of, let's say a farmer does choose to use Enlist soybeans, so he's got however many shuttles full of Enlist. maybe a little bit of glyphosate, maybe a little bit of Liberty, wants to use those latter two products sparingly because he knows that it could be difficult to, or certainly very expensive to get more, what's that person going to do? Right. So there's just a lot of uncertainty, I think, around this issue and also still around the extend issue in the over-the-top dicamba. The EPA made a big announcement right before Christmas that basically said, we're not doing anything. Here's the data we're considering. The concern, the undercurrent that I hear in conversations among weed scientists is, well, what's the circuit court down in Arizona going to do with all of this information that the EPA has dumped, knowing that they have some groups that are wanting them to pursue some of the cases that are before them related to particularly use of dicamba. So, they're both good products. They're both good systems. I think farmers can be successful with both systems, but there are certainly a lot of things to consider when making the choices here that we haven't always had to think about.
With all of these dynamics in play, the best thing is for the producer to keep a running dialogue with her supplier, stay on top of the developments at hand?
Absolutely. I think, this year more than ever, those relationships, whether it be your herbicide supplier or your seed dealer, keeping communication open with those folks and figuring out what they can and can't do, that will help guys decide, what they should or shouldn't do. But I think, the words of advice that we've been talking about related to the herbicide shortages, they're still going to help with these situations, right? We're talking about just good weed management and good agronomics. Just taking extra time. I know. I know.
What is that?
Yeah, what is that? What do you mean? But unfortunately, Eric, other than, looking at things on a case-by-case basis and seeing what options folks have for their particular operation, there's not a good blanket recommendation here. Other than, as you said, communication and just being aware of these changes, because these are both very fluid situations. My team is going to do our best to make sure that we are, looking through the data and helping folks see the numbers in terms of weed management behind, the various options that they might have.
We'll be having conversations. Heading right into the spring. Sarah, thank you for taking a few moments away from the conference to pass along this information.
Thanks, Eric.
Sarah Lancaster, Weed Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, along with us from the 2021 Cover Your Acres Winter Conference. Ongoing today and tomorrow in Oberlin, where she's talking about the myriad of things you crop producers need to be thinking about as you map out your weed control program for 2022 production. We'll be back with still more for you here on Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today, and time once again for another installment of Milk Lines for you dairy producers. And this week, Research and Extension Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk of K-State talks about the economics of a specific feedstuff for the dairy cow herd. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the value of cottonseed in our dairy diets. As I look at different feedstuffs, and I took some time this morning to evaluate some things on our own dairy here at K-State. We've fed whole cottonseed here for a long time, and sometimes it is a situation where we continue to feed it even though it may not be the most economical thing to feed, but because of our situation with research trials and other things, we've chosen to keep it in. But this morning, as I sorted through some of the dollar and cents issues when it comes to whole cottonseed for our own dairy, I realized that in today's feed market, whole cottonseed actually isn't too bad of a buy. And one of the reasons that it's an economical buy, at least for our dairy at this point, is that it brings two important things to the diet. Number one, it brings some protein to the diet, and number two, some fat, which is mostly rumen bypass. It also brings significant fiber, but for most of us, we've got plenty of fiber sitting around on the dairy, so that's maybe not as big a deal to most of our dairies as to some that are maybe looking for sources of the fiber. So let's concentrate on the protein and the fat issue. So we look at supplemental fat, whole cottonseed's 20-21% crude fat. So a couple of pounds of that gets you to about 0.4 pounds of added fat. If you look at the cost of doing that, it's actually fairly reasonable. Whole cottonseed probably can be purchased for about 17 cents a pound. So for about 34 cents a cow a day, if you're adding 2 pounds to the diet, you can get about 0.4 pounds of added fat. So as you look at other fat sources that are out there and available to you, and you look at their cost, I think you'll find from a fat standpoint it's fairly reasonable. From a crude protein standpoint, it does contain a significant amount of crude protein, usually about 22% or so, maybe 23%, depending on the type that you might be getting. So as you think about that in relationship to soybean meal, is it more expensive as a source of crude protein than soybean meal? Yes, it would be. However, when you look at the value of the fat that's coming with that, you realize very quickly that it is a fairly economical feed. So let's get to the bottom line here. If you do feed some whole cottonseed in the diet, how much milk response would you have to pay for that extra expense? Well, based on our current prices for milk, it'd take about 1 pound of milk to pay for 2 pounds of whole cottonseed in the diet. So, many cases, we can find research trials that would indicate that feeding a small amount of whole cottonseed in the diet may actually increase your milk production in your herd more than that. Now, here's the thing that you have to be able to target, I think, to really make this work. You have to be able to target those high-producing cows that are going to really benefit from it. If you're just feeding a one-group TMR on your dairy, I think this is maybe a hard sell. But if you're feeding a high-group TMR, including some whole cottonseed in that high-group TMR, would provide you with some excellent source of fat as well as protein to reduce that side of the ration in terms of cost. So I encourage you, if you've not considered whole cottonseed in your ration, that you take some time and you visit with your nutritionist to see whether or not this might be an economical choice for your high group cows. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
All right, Mike, thank you. And while we've a moment here, a quick calendar item for you beef cattle producers. K-State's 2022 Winter Ranch Management Seminar Series is upcoming. These are focused on enhancing profit in beef production via several presentations by K-State personnel. These seminars set for Tuesday, February the 8th in Hayes, Thursday the 10th of February in Council Grove, Tuesday, February 15th in Randolph, and Thursday, February the 24th at Oakley. Find out more about this Winter Ranch Management Seminar Series at ksubeef.org. That's our time for today. Thanks to you for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.